My name is Sierra, and I am 29 years old. I used to believe that betrayal came with shouting, with slammed doors, with obvious drama you could point to and say, that's where everything broke. I was wrong. In my life, betrayal arrived quietly, wrapped in paperwork, signed with familiar names, and justified with smiles. My grandmother's lake house was never just a property to me. It was the one place in my childhood that felt steady, the one place where voices softened instead of sharpened. When she passed away, the grief was heavy, but there was also a strange comfort in knowing she had left that lake house to me in her will. Everyone in the family knew it. It wasn't a secret, wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't something vague or debatable. It was clear. The house was mine. I didn't even get the chance to sit with that reality before deployment orders pulled me overseas. Duty has a way of compressing your personal life into a small box you promised to open later. I left believing that whatever tensions existed in my family, at least something as solid as a legal will would remain untouched. I was thousands of miles away when my phone buzzed one night in the dim light of the barracks. It was my sister. No greeting, no warmth, just a message that made my stomach drop. Thanks for your service. That was it. No context, no explanation. Just those 3 words sitting on my screen like a riddle I didn't want to solve. I read it again and again, feeling a cold unease I couldn't name. I replied with a simple question mark. No answer came. Days later, through a distant relative who spoke in the careful tone people use when they know they're delivering something ugly, I learned the truth. My parents had sold my grandmother's lake house, sold it. A home valued at $450,000, a home legally left to me, converted into cash without my knowledge while I was deployed. The reason came packaged like a noble cause. They needed to fund my sister's restaurant, as if my inheritance was some communal emergency reserve, as if my absence meant my ownership had simply evaporated. Anger didn't arrive first. Disbelief did, the kind that makes you feel detached from your own body, like you're listening to someone else's story. I kept waiting for the missing piece, the clarification that would make it all make sense. There wasn't one. They hadn't asked. They hadn't informed me. They had decided. My sister's message suddenly transformed from confusing to cruel. Thanks for your service. Not gratitude, but mockery. A neat little acknowledgement that while I was risking my life, they were dismantling mine. I didn't respond for 3 months. Not to my sister, not to my parents. Not to the voicemails that shifted from defensive to pleading to irritated. Silence became my only form of control, the only boundary I could enforce from a different continent. Every night the thought looped in my head. They sold my house, my grandmother's last gift to me, as if I were already gone for good. When my deployment ended, everyone assumed I would come home for a family dinner, for emotional conversations, for apologies and explanations delivered over carefully arranged plates. That illusion lasted right up until the day I landed. I didn't drive to my parents' house. I didn't call ahead. I went somewhere else entirely. Because while I was deployed, I hadn't just been silent. I had been preparing. Paperwork, consultations, evidence, all the quiet, tedious steps that feel surreal when you're taking legal action against your own family. So when I finally came home, it wasn't to a dining table or awkward hugs. I walked into a courtroom, not a family dinner. The air inside was cold and formal, stripped of the emotional chaos that had consumed me for months. My parents were already there, my father wearing the same expression of irritated confidence he had carried through most of my life, the look of a man who believed authority and righteousness were interchangeable. My sister sat behind them, arms folded, gaze carefully avoiding mine. No one looked like they expected consequences. That was the part that hurt the most. They hadn't just taken something from me. They had assumed I would accept it. The proceedings blurred together at first. Legal language, timelines, documents, until the moment that mattered. The judge began speaking, voice calm, precise, devastatingly clear. Each sentence stripped away the justifications my parents had clung to. Each statement reframed their decision as exactly what it was. I watched my father's posture change, watched certainty drain from his face in slow, visible stages, and then came the words that shattered the last of his composure. What the judge said didn't just challenge him, it ended the story he had been telling himself. His shoulders dropped, his hands trembled, and before anyone could react, he collapsed back into his chair, as if the weight of reality had finally become too heavy to stand against. People think the most dramatic part of my story is the moment my father collapsed in that courtroom. But the truth is, that was only the visible fracture. The real breaking point had already happened long before. The day my own parents decided my inheritance was theirs to liquidate. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the silence that followed the judge's words. It wasn't loud or chaotic like scenes in movies. It was sharp, stunned, and suffocating. My father didn't fall to the floor. He didn't cry out. He simply crumpled backward into his chair, his confidence draining so completely it looked as though someone had pulled the structure out of him. For a second, nobody moved. Not my mother. Not my sister.
Not even me.
The authority he had carried for decades, the unspoken rule that his decisions were final and evaporated in a single moment. The judge's ruling was not emotional, not angry, not theatrical. It was clinical and final. The sale of the lake house had been unlawful. The property had been legally mine. The funds obtained from the sale were subject to full restitution, alongside penalties and legal consequences. Simple sentences, delivered without cruelty, yet devastating in impact. I remember staring at my father's face, trying to reconcile the man who had raised me with the man now sitting there, pale and shaking, unable to even maintain eye contact with the bench. This was the same person who had once lectured me about responsibility, about respect, about family loyalty. Yet here we were, in a courtroom, because those principles had apparently never applied to him. My mother's reaction came next, but it wasn't remorse. It was panic. The kind of panic that comes not from guilt, but from the sudden realization that actions have consequences. She kept whispering my father's name, gripping his arm, her eyes darting between him and the judge as though this might still somehow reverse itself. My sister looked frozen, her jaw tense, her expression caught between anger and disbelief. I wondered what version of the story she had told herself. That it was justified? That I would understand? That being deployed made my rights negotiable? Her restaurant, the reason my home had been sold, suddenly seemed like a fragile, expensive illusion balanced on a foundation of someone else's loss. The hearing ended without drama. That was the strangest part. No shouting, no cinematic speeches, no emotional reconciliation. Just paperwork, instructions, and the quiet machinery of the legal system moving forward. As people began to stand, the reality of what had happened settled heavily into the room. My father remained seated longer than everyone else, staring ahead as though the world had tilted. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Not physically, but psychologically stripped of the certainty that had once dominated every room he entered. When he finally tried to stand, his legs seemed unsteady, his movements slow and uncertain. I didn't feel triumph. That's something people often misunderstand about stories like mine. There was no victorious rush, no satisfying surge of revenge. What I felt was something far more complicated and far heavier. Grief for the family I thought I had, mixed with a cold clarity about the family I actually had. Legal justice does not magically repair emotional damage. It simply draws boundaries around behavior. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, almost surreal. My mother approached me first, her voice trembling, suddenly soft in a way it had never been when defending their decision. She spoke about misunderstandings, about intentions, about family mistakes. But there are some lines that, once crossed, cannot be redefined with softer language. Selling someone's inheritance without consent is not a misunderstanding. It is a choice. My sister didn't speak to me at all. She stood at a distance, arms crossed, her silence louder than any argument. My father avoided my eyes completely. The man who had once commanded obedience could not even face me. And in that moment, I understood something that changed me permanently. Accountability had arrived not because I argued harder, not because I demanded louder, but because I refused to accept what was wrong. Because silence, preparation, and persistence had carried more power than emotional confrontation ever could. The lake house was never just about money. It was about dignity, about ownership, about the basic expectation that my absence did not erase my rights. People often ask me whether it was worth it. The legal battle, the permanent fracture in my family, the emotional cost. My answer is always the same. Some losses are unavoidable the moment the betrayal happens. The courtroom did not destroy my family. Their decision did. What the judge's ruling did was something else entirely. It restored reality. It forced truth into a space where denial had comfortably lived. And sometimes, truth is the heaviest consequence of all. If you've ever been told to stay quiet, to accept injustice for the sake of keeping peace, remember this: peace built on your silence is not peace. It is permission. And the day you stop granting that permission is the day everything begins to change.